Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening with the fire sale of Lukoil's overseas assets. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that I've posted a number of videos talking about the fact that Lukoil, which is the second largest oil company in Russia, the largest private company, was sanctioned on the 23rd of October by the USA, and as a direct result of that, it's now unable to continue trading all of its overseas operations. And Lukoil was the company that Russia was really using to extend its global reach. It had purchased lots of different assets in lots of different countries. But unfortunately, because of the sanctions, those assets can no longer make or receive payments, and so they're going to have to get rid of them. And of course, when you're sanctioned, you can't actually receive any money. So Lukoil is in a really difficult situation at the moment because it can't do anything. It's frozen, basically. But the USA originally put a deadline of the 21st of November to have these assets transferred away from Lukoil. But it's now extended that deadline to the 13th of December. And the reason why the USA has done that is because Russia, as it stands, and Lukoil are facing the prospect of getting zero value for all of these assets. So if Russia wanted to, it could become really awkward and just basically try to close everything down and disrupt the global supply of oil, and also severely disrupt what's happening in some of the individual countries. We talked about it before, but Bulgaria is very dependent on the Lukoil refinery. It's the only big refinery in Bulgaria. So Bulgaria needs all of that oil to keep flowing. Otherwise, the Bulgarian economy is going to be thrown into a potential recession situation. If you can't get access to gasoline or diesel, then basically everything will grind to a halt. So the USA wants an orderly handover of all of these assets. And by extending the deadline to the middle of December, Lukoil has the potential to negotiate some deals. So it won't be able to receive the cash, but what will happen is that the cash, if any cash deals are agreed, then the cash would be frozen. It'd be put into an escrow account. And then at some point in the future, if sanctions are lifted against Lukoil, Lukoil would be able to get access to that cash. So there's an incentive here for Lukoil and Russia to actually do the right thing and to negotiate deals, because obviously Russia wants these sanctions to be lifted at some point down the road. And in addition to the extension to the 13th of December for most of the assets, the Bulgarian assets have been given an extension to the 29th of April 2026. And the reason why is because it is so critical to the Bulgarian economy. Now, Bulgaria actually passed a law allowing it to nationalize all of those assets. But I think that's now being held up in a legal process. As I reported in my previous video, the president of Bulgaria had actually vetoed that law, saying that he was unsure whether or not Bulgaria would then be open to being taken to the High Court by Russia. So that's the last thing that Bulgaria wanted, to get caught up in a legal wrangle, which would have brought that refinery to a grinding halt. So it's not being nationalised as it stands at the moment, and there are deals trying to be negotiated, and we'll talk about who's interested in buying these assets later in the video. But one thing I also wanted to cover is something called the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, which actually has a huge pipeline that goes from Kazakhstan all the way to one of the ports in Russia. And the reason why this is important is because this pipeline is carrying 1.6 million barrels of oil per day from Kazakhstan through Russia to the Russian port, and then it's being exported to countries in Europe and beyond. And that actually represents around 1.5% of the global supply. And the reason why this is important is because it's crossing over Russian territory. And so Russia has an economic interest through Lukoil, but also, even if it doesn't, even if that was nationalized, Russia could actually disrupt that flow of oil by just taking out the pipeline. So if you have a look at this map, it shows where that pipeline flows from. So as you can see, there are a couple of major oil fields in Kazakhstan, which are supplying the pipeline. It then passes over basically the whole width of Russia. So this is a very long pipeline and goes to a terminal in the Black Sea. You might be thinking, well, why did Kazakhstan do that? Because they've got the Caspian Sea. Why didn't they just use their own ports in the Caspian Sea? But if you have a look at this map, which sort of zooms out a bit, the Caspian Sea, even though it's called a sea, is actually technically the largest lake in the world because it doesn't actually flow through to any of the oceans. So, whilst Kazakhstan does have its coastline with the Caspian Sea, it's actually technically landlocked because you don't have a way of transporting that oil via tankers to the major oceans. So the reason why the pipeline was built is because Russia, which has the Black Sea, actually has the opportunity to export oil globally because in the Black Sea, if we zoom in a little bit, there is actually something called the Bosphorus Strait, which goes through Turkey, which gives the tankers the ability to move from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea and beyond. So that's why Kazakhstan built that pipeline, because it gave it better access to the global markets. But as you can see from the pipeline map, most of it runs through Russia. So as I said, if Russia really wanted to be awkward about this, they could basically disrupt that pipeline. They could disconnect it, they could stop it flowing, because Kazakhstan has to pay a fee for that oil to flow through. Now, in terms of who owns this pipeline and who owns all of the oil, well, this is when we start to get into the bigger picture as to what's going on here. This pie chart shows the ownership of the Caspian pipeline, and as you can see, it's split amongst a lot of different companies, and those companies have different nationalities. And two of them are Russian. So Lukoil owns 12.5% of this pipeline. But in addition to that, Transneft, which is the Russian transfer business, the pipeline operator, owns 24%. So between them, those two Russian entities own 36% of that pipeline. But as you can see, there's lots of other businesses. So we've got a Kazakhstan business owns 19%, Chevron owns 15%, Mobil Caspian Pipeline, which is a US company, owns 7.5%. We've then got a joint venture between Rosneft and the USA, owning another 7.5%. And we've got a whole lot of other different smaller holdings. So this is a proper consortium owning that pipeline. And the reason why they want to keep the oil flowing is because there are lots of international interests in the oil. This breakdown shows the ownership of the Kazakhstan oil that's being pumped out of the ground and through that pipeline. So we've got three different oil fields here. And as you can see in terms of the ownership split, two of these fields are partially owned by Russia. So if we look at the oil field at the top first, you can see that it's owned 29.25% by Eni from Italy, 29.25% by Shell from the UK, 18% by Chevron from the USA, 13.5% by Lukoil from Russia, and 10% by a Kazakhstan company. For the second oil field, there is a 17% holding by Eni, ExxonMobil, the Kazakhstan company, Shell, and Total Energy from France. China own 8% and Japan owns 7.6%. So there is no Russian ownership of that oil. And in the third oil field, we've got a 50% ownership by Chevron, 25% by ExxonMobil, 20% by a Kazakhstan company, and 5% by a Russian business. So these entities are pulling the oil out of the ground and then sending it through that pipeline. So they are ultimately benefiting from the sale of that oil. So if this pipeline was to stop, if no oil flowed through it, then all of these companies in all of these different countries would suffer. So that would be a problem in terms of profitability for them. But also, we would see a big drop in the global supply of oil. And as I talked about in previous videos, one of the reasons why Russian companies have been sanctioned recently, Rosneft and Lukoil, is because the Russian supply of oil is no longer needed to keep the global balance where it needs to be. However, if we start to see the loss of things like this Kazakhstan oil, which represents 1.5%, then that could send oil prices spiking again and cause a global recession. And the USA doesn't want that, so that's why it's allowed this extra time for deals to be agreed by Lukoil so that all of the assets can then be taken over by new owners. So in terms of answering the question as to what these assets are actually worth, it's an interesting one because if you've been following the channel, you'll know that Gunvor, which was classified as a puppet of the Kremlin, so basically very closely linked to Russia, had offered a deal of $22 billion to buy all of the overseas assets in one big bundle. Now, that deal's obviously fallen apart, And it's likely now that we will see a much reduced price for all of these assets, maybe as low as 8 to 10 billion, because this is now a fire sale. Any buyer knows that it can come in and swoop in and get these assets for a bargain basement price. And the reason why buyers want to actually acquire them is because this is a unique opportunity. Usually, in the world of oil and gas, you have to develop your own facilities. So it's very rare to be able to buy assets of this nature that are fully operating and ready to go and producing lots of cash flow. So the buyers are really quite keen to get involved, because normally, if you were going to build an oil refinery in Bulgaria, you'd have to invest billions of dollars, maybe even tens of billions of dollars, and the payback period on that would be extremely long. You'd have to wait maybe 10, 15, 20 years before you really get to the point where you're making huge profits, because it's such a big capital investment. And also, in terms of time frames, it can take anything up to 2 or 3 years, or maybe even longer, to develop those facilities, because in many situations they're quite complicated, and then you have to set up all of the supply chains, hire all of the people, get everything involved in all the logistics of exporting all of the oil. So it's a massive job to start these things from scratch. So it's very rare that these sort of assets ever come up for sale, because once they're built and operational, you just sit back, let the oil flow, and let the cash flow come flooding through. So it's very attractive, and obviously it's an attractive market in terms of there's a lot of demand for oil. It's constantly increasing, even though we're moving towards renewable energy. Everybody is still really dependent on fossil fuels at the moment. So there are lots of different buyers who are now interested in purchasing these assets. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because you may have seen reports in the press recently that people like Carlyle, the big private equity firm that's based in the USA, are rumoured to be putting together a bid to buy all of Lukoil's assets. And you might have thought, well, that's impossible. And I talked about it in a previous video, saying that it's really not realistic for Carlyle to put together a fully funded bid within a matter of days for something where they might be paying $10 billion. That's not how the world of M&A and huge acquisitions work. You can get things done very quickly. And I know when I used to work in that world that you could work night and day to put together your bid. However, realistically, Carlyle would be taking a real punt, because they wouldn't be able to do any due diligence within 2 or 3 days. They just have to guess what these things were worth. And that's a big gamble when you're talking about investors' funds of $5 or $10 billion. So the USA has now extended the deadline until the middle of December, and that will give companies like Carlyle and Shell and lots of other rumoured bidders time to be able to put together something. They can see the oil flows, they'll be able to estimate how much that's worth. Lukoil may be able to provide some information, but there's no details yet as to whether that is happening. But it would be in Lukoil's interests to give as much information as possible, because obviously that might get the price a bit higher. So a deal process is now underway. Lots of people are running around trying to put together bids to buy those assets. And as I said earlier in the video, the reason why they're doing that is that it's very rare of the assets of this nature come up for sale in an industry which is very attractive to lots of different buyers, particularly private equity, because it throws off lots of cash, particularly if you can buy something that's already operating and is just in the cash cow stage, which a lot of these assets are. So this is an attractive opportunity for lots of different buyers. But what I wanted to talk about in today's video really is what's happening from Russia's point of view. And this is an absolute disaster, because even though there is now some sort of sale process going on and some sort of bids will be put together, and Lukoil may get paid something for these assets, which is better than what I was talking about originally, whereby everything was going to be nationalised and Lukoil wouldn't get 1 cent. It still won't receive any money because it's still sanctioned by the USA and lots of other countries. So Lukoil can't receive a payment. If you made a payment to Lukoil right now, you yourself would be sanctioned. So that money won't actually go to Russia. What will happen with it, if any funds that are paid for these assets, will be frozen in the same way as all of Russia's original assets were frozen, the $300 billion worth of overseas cash that was sitting in lots of financial institutions. That's still frozen from 3.5 years ago. This money will join those frozen assets, and will only be released at some point if the sanctions against Russia and Lukoil particularly are released. Now, we don't know when that's going to happen. We don't even know if that is going to happen, because if the war in Ukraine goes on indefinitely, then those sanctions will remain in place indefinitely. But Lukoil does have the chance of getting that money at some point in the future. So it will want to negotiate the best deal that it can. So that's what's happening right now. But from Russia's point of view, what we are seeing here is the extraction of all of these overseas operations. It will no longer feed into the Russian state. So historically, Lukoil was making lots of money from all of these assets. That's why they invested into them. That's why they bought them, because it's a lucrative business. So they were receiving all of that revenue, all of that cash flow, all of that foreign income, which was highly useful to both Lukoil and the Russian state. And of course, as Lukoil made more profit, it was paying more tax and contributing to GDP in Russia. So none of that will be happening going forward. Lukoil has lost its empire. One way or the other, these assets will be changing hands over the next few months. So Lukoil won't get any benefit in the short term or the medium term until those sanctions are lifted. So that will be bad news for Lukoil as a business. It's no longer a global player. It's just a Russian entity. And it's also bad news for the Russian state, because they'll be seeing less income coming through Lukoil, but also Russia's influence in countries like Bulgaria and Kazakhstan and lots of other entities around the world is reducing, because it's no longer a player in those markets. So the bottom line here is that all of this is seriously bad news for Lukoil and also Russia as a direct result of the sanctions that were applied against Lukoil. So once again, this is a good example of how the sanctions are now really hurting Russia's economy. And the longer that these sanctions remain in place, the worse it's going to get from Russia's point of view. And there will come a point where Russia is going to run out of cash, and it's going to have to fund the war in Ukraine from debt. And the big question is, who's going to buy that debt? I recently made a video talking about the fact that Russia is looking to issue bonds denominated in Chinese yuan because it wants to sell those bonds into China. However, will Chinese investors want to buy them? I'm not convinced that they will. So Russia is in a very serious situation right now. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I know more than 50% of people watching these videos haven't subscribed, so please hit that red button. It doesn't cost you anything. It's not really a subscription, but it does help me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me. If you bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a Patreon or a YouTube member or buy me a coffee member, really appreciate that support. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.